Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Shroudex. Somewhere in Washington State right now, a door inside someone's house is about to start knocking, not the front door. A door already inside the home, the kind nobody thinks twice about walking past every single day. It won't stop knocking. Not for minutes, not for hours, not until somebody finally gives in and opens it. On the other side is a man with something to sell, a price that's never actually about money. And, as you're about to find out, a boss he's genuinely terrified of disappointing. This is SCP-1879. This is the Indoor Salesman. Item number 1879. Object Class Keter. Written by an author credited as Mars Lifeform. If you've watched our orientation episode on this channel, that classification should already be doing some work in your head. Keter means containment is difficult, expensive, and never fully guaranteed. It's the word this archive reserves for its biggest, most overwhelming threats. The kind of anomaly that needs armed task forces and reinforced vaults just to be kept in one place. This file earns that same word in a completely different way. There's no vault here, no armed standoff, no creature clawing at a containment door. What you're about to hear is Keter-class horror delivered through a sales pitch. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly why that ordinary framing might be more unsettling than a monster ever could be. Think back to the locked box test our very first episode on this channel explained. Put the anomaly in a sealed box. If nothing happens, it's safe. If you don't know what will happen, it's Euclid. If it escapes easily, it's Keter. This file breaks that test in an entirely different direction than anything else we've covered. The box isn't the problem here. The problem is that there's no box shaped anything like the threat in the first place. Because the threat looks, sounds, and dresses exactly like an ordinary man standing in your hallway. Fact, rather than preventing anything before it happens. In practice, that means watching rather than holding. Foundation agents are instructed to monitor police reports across Washington State, searching for a very specific, recognizable pattern of complaint. A persistent, aggressive salesman who seems to appear and disappear through doors that shouldn't lead anywhere unusual at all. It's containment procedure rewritten as a subscription to the local news. Compare this to almost every other Keter file this channel has broken down. Those files usually fail at containment because the anomaly is too strong, too fast, or too widespread to physically hold. This one fails for a completely different reason. There's genuinely nothing to hold. He isn't a creature you can trap in a cell. He's a transaction arriving and leaving through a door that reverts to total ordinariness the second he's gone, leaving Foundation researchers with nothing solid to point their usual toolkit at. When a pattern is confirmed, a specific task force gets the call. MTF Rho-4 and their nickname does most of the explaining before you even hear what they actually do. Shoos Salesmen. Compare that name to the units our orientation episode already introduced you to. Task forces built around breach response or negotiation, or sheer overwhelming force against something openly hostile. Rho-4 isn't built for any of that. Their instructions are almost apologetically plain. Deal with the entity at the minimum possible cost to everyone involved. Whatever's recovered during an encounter gets incinerated if that's an option, dismantled if it isn't, and any witnesses left behind are amnesticized before the night is over. It's one of the more mundane-sounding task forces this channel has ever covered, and that mundanity is doing real work. This isn't an elite strike team storming a breach. It's closer to a specialized cleanup crew, permanently on call for a threat the Foundation still hasn't figured out how to actually stop from happening in the first place. There's something almost funny, in the darkest possible sense, about an organization capable of fielding task forces against gods and apocalypses, needing a specific unit whose entire job description amounts to getting an unwanted salesman out of somebody's living room. But that's exactly the tone this file has been building since its very first line. The horror here was never going to look like a war. It was always going to look like an incredibly persistent door-to-door pitch that occasionally kills everyone in the room. Here's where the file starts narrowing its own rules in a way that feels almost deliberately strange. This phenomenon has only ever been documented in one American state, Washington, nowhere else on record. And within that single state, it's even more specific than that. Only interior doors are ever affected. designated in the file as SCP-1879-1. Never a front door. Never anything facing the outside world. From the outside, every single one of these doors looks completely boringly ordinary, indistinguishable from the door to a bathroom or a hallway closet in any other house in the country. That narrowness matters more than it might seem to on a first pass. Every other threat this channel has documented tends to expand outward eventually. More sightings, wider territory, escalating frequency. This one has stayed confined to one state and one specific category of door for as long as the Foundation has been tracking it, which raises a question the file itself never answers. Not why it's dangerous, why it's chosen to stay so small. It's worth sitting with how deliberately mundane that geography is, too. Most anomalies this channel has covered are tied to dramatic locations, deep jungle, ancient ruins, classified underground facilities. This one is tied to one ordinary American state, and specifically to the most overlooked doors inside an ordinary home. The ones nobody photographs, nobody locks, nobody thinks to monitor. The horror isn't hiding somewhere exotic. It's hiding in the most boring architectural feature imaginable, which is precisely why it took so long for anyone to notice a pattern at all. The trigger itself is almost insultingly simple. Any sapient being within roughly 2 meters of one of these doors sets it off. Knocking begins almost immediately, quiet at first, easy to dismiss as the house settling, or a draft catching a loose hinge. It doesn't stay easy to dismiss for long. The knocking simply doesn't stop. Not for minutes, not for hours, until somebody in the house finally opens the door themselves. What steps out once it's opened is designated SCP-1879-2. A humanoid figure, roughly 1.7 meters tall, Caucasian in appearance, with an age that's genuinely impossible to pin down from looking at him. Nothing about his appearance would earn a second glance on an ordinary street. That's precisely the problem. This isn't a creature you'd instinctively recoil from. It's a man who could plausibly be your neighbor, standing in your hallway, holding something out toward you with an unnervingly eager expression. That ordinariness is doing more narrative work than it might seem to at first. Every other entity this channel has covered under this format announces itself as dangerous somehow, through size, through appearance, through some visible wrongness a witness could point to and immediately understand. This one passes every casual glance a person could give it. The danger here was never going to be recognized on sight. It was always going to have to be learned the hard way, one transaction at a time, by people who had no reason to be suspicious until it was already too late to matter. He always has something to sell. What varies wildly from encounter to encounter, a signed record, a leather belt, on at least one occasion something as serious as a handgun. His pitch is dramatic, and frequently cornering in the most literal sense, often suggesting the homeowner sit down before he's even finished his opening line, a tactic that also happens to put physical distance between them and the nearest exit. None of it is actually persuasive in the ordinary sense. The file is explicit that his tactics are underhanded rather than convincing, closer to psychological pressure than salesmanship. Once the pitch winds down, he names his price, and it's almost never money. Whatever he asks for tends to cost the subject something they never saw coming, something they didn't realize was on the table until it was already gone. Ask him what a price actually means in plain terms, and he simply won't answer. That refusal isn't incidental. It's part of the mechanism. Hesitate too long trying to figure it out on your own, and the price only climbs higher the longer you wait, which means the safest response, according to every documented encounter in this file, is almost never the one that feels safest in the moment. There's a specific kind of dread built into that refusal to explain his prices, and it's worth naming directly. Every ordinary transaction gives you the information you need to consent to it honestly. A price tag tells you exactly what you're giving up before you agree to the trade. This entity strips that basic fairness away entirely, asking for agreement to a cost he won't define, from people who have no real way to weigh what they're about to lose until it's already gone. That's not just an unfair sale, it's the exact mechanism that makes every documented tragedy in this file possible in the first place. He doesn't take no for an answer easily, not the first time it's said to him, but threaten him, or heard him, and he retreats immediately back into the door he came through, which reverts instantly to being a completely ordinary door the moment he's gone. He doesn't stay gone, though. He comes back through a different door somewhere else in the same house later, and noticeably angrier than before. And when he returns, the price for whatever he's still trying to sell has only gotten worse. It's a punishment structure that rewards exactly one response, immediate compliance, and makes every other option, refusal, delay, force, more expensive than the one before it. Notice, too, what this punishment structure actually teaches anyone who survives a first encounter. Compliance gets rewarded with a merely unfair transaction. Resistance gets punished with an angrier return visit and a worse price the second time around. It's a system almost perfectly engineered to make victims complicit in their own losses, teaching an entire state's worth of potential targets that the safest, fastest way through an encounter with this thing is simply to give him whatever he wants and hope the cost isn't as bad as it could have been. The Foundation's retrieval log records several completed transactions, and the range between them is genuinely disorienting to read back to back. The first is deceptively simple. One red rose offered the way anyone might offer a small, romantic gesture. The price, in his own words, was simply the subject's heart. The subject accepted, and his cardiovascular system stopped existing entirely. On the spot, no drama, no warning beyond the price itself. The rose stayed behind on the table. He didn't. Not every transaction ends that way, though, and the file's willingness to sit right next to genuine tragedy with something almost comedic is part of what makes this entry so uniquely disturbing. One transaction involved 220 bananas delivered all at once for a price that sounded, by the file's own account, more like a bad pickup line than a real demand. The cost turned out to be every piece of candy already in the house, all of it, simply gone by the time anyone checked. The strangest transaction on record involves an actual thermonuclear explosive device, handed over with the same casual energy as the rose. The price this time was, in his words, her soul. She hesitated, then agreed, and nothing visibly happened in the room afterward. It was only later that she noticed two specific records missing from her collection, both albums by Aretha Franklin, Lady Soul and Almighty Fire. Her literal soul was never actually what he took. The device itself was eventually recovered by the Foundation and now sits safely in storage, but the wordplay sitting underneath that entire transaction tells you something important about how this entity actually thinks. Even his cruelty comes wrapped in a joke he clearly finds funnier than anyone he's selling to. Read those 3 transactions back to back, and the file's real strategy becomes obvious. It isn't trying to scare you with consistency. It's trying to scare you with unpredictability. You can't prepare for an encounter with this entity by studying the last one, because the same casual tone that produced 200 bananas and a joke about candy is capable, in the very next sentence, of producing a death so instantaneous the victim likely never understood what had actually happened to him. That whiplash between harmless and lethal, delivered in the exact same voice every single time, is doing more work in this file than any single transaction could manage alone. One of the fullest records the Foundation has of a single encounter comes from a home in Seattle, belonging to a woman named Shirley Yates. She'd called the police more than once, describing a persistent salesman who wouldn't leave and kept vanishing into doors that made no sense. By the time Foundation agents arrived, the entity was holding a border collie puppy directly in front of her, mid-pitch, claiming vague personal reasons for giving it up, insisting all he wanted in return was a little of her time. Agent Rogers tried repeatedly to interrupt and redirect the encounter. The entity talked over him every single time, refusing to engage with the Foundation directly at all, speaking only to Yates as though the agents in the room weren't really there. Eventually, agents restrained him and gagged him with a towel, intending to remove him for interrogation. The moment he was walked through the home's front doorway, an exterior door rather than one of his usual interior ones, he simply vanished. A full search of the house turned up nothing. It looked, for a moment, like the encounter was over. It's also worth noticing how differently this entity behaves once actual law enforcement involvement enters the picture. Earlier in this file, Refusal simply means a worse price on a later visit. Here, faced with direct Foundation intervention for what may be the first time in the entire document, his response shifts from persistence into something closer to genuine evasion, talking past the agents entirely rather than engaging them, treating the actual authorities in the room as an inconvenience to be worked around rather than a threat to be confronted head-on. It wasn't over. 6 hours later, he reappeared inside the same house, and agents found Mrs. Yates cornered, still holding out against him. This time, he was more direct than he'd been all day. "Take the dog," he told her, and he'd finally leave for good. The cost, clarified plainly at last, was 12 years of her time. She took the puppy. The instant the exchange completed, she vanished from the room entirely. He thanked the room for its business, in the same tone he might use closing out any ordinary sale, stepped calmly into a nearby closet, and was gone before anyone could close the distance. 12 years later, Mrs. Yates was found at the exact same location inside the house, physically unchanged. No memory whatsoever of where she'd actually been for over a decade. It's one of the quietest, least violent entries in this entire file, and arguably one of the most disturbing precisely because of that. Nobody died. Nobody was hurt in any way a hospital could treat. A woman simply lost 12 years of her own life to a stranger who wanted a dog off his hands, and walked away from the transaction with no memory of the price she'd actually paid. That specific kind of loss, time itself, taken without a mark left on the body, is a very different flavor of horror than anything else in this file. The rose and the coins both leave something behind for someone else to find: a death, a scene, an obvious tragedy. This transaction leaves nothing visible at all. A woman simply disappears from her own life for over a decade, then reappears exactly where she vanished, aged not a day, carrying no memory and no evidence that anything happened to her whatsoever. If a neighbor hadn't known her personally for that entire span, there would be no way to even prove the encounter occurred. A separate piece of surveillance audio captures something the entity almost certainly never intended for anyone to overhear. Before the door even opens, agents recorded him muttering to himself on the other side, complaining about a quota. Missing it, by his own words, means being stuck in this world for another century. A soft musical tone interrupts his complaint mid-sentence, and the knocking that had been building stops instantly. What follows sounds unmistakably like a phone call, one-sided, nervous, apologetic, exactly the tone of someone bracing for bad news from a superior. He promises to meet his quota. He asks, quietly, almost pleadingly, not to be hurt for falling behind. Once the call ends, he mutters something to himself that quietly reframes everything this episode has shown you so far. He hopes this is finally enough to move him up to accounting. Not revenge, not conquest, a transfer request. Whatever this entity actually is, this file makes clear he isn't doing any of this by choice. He's doing it because it's his job, and by every available piece of evidence, he wants out of it as badly as any of his victims ever wanted him gone. It's worth pausing on how differently this single recording reframes every transaction covered so far in this episode. The rose, the bananas, the bomb. None of them were ever really about the homeowners answering those doors. They were quota numbers, one entity's individual output toward a target set by someone else entirely, someone with enough authority over him that the mere possibility of missing a deadline is enough to make him audibly afraid, alone in a hallway, moments before putting on the same confident, cornering pitch you've heard him deliver throughout this entire file. That same recording captures the exact moment this entire pattern turns lethal. Agent Rogers, present for the encounter, finally pulls the door open himself and restrains the entity directly, cutting off any chance of a retreat back through it. Cornered, the entity offers something unusual for him. No money out of anyone's pocket, he says, an offer that sounds, in the moment, almost generous. Just call it even. Within seconds, roughly 2,000 coins of mixed and unidentified origin appeared inside the pockets, the skin, and the digestive tracts of every single person present in that room except him. Every Foundation agent at the scene was confirmed dead. He was reportedly seen later that same day at a different house, Further down the same street, already gone again by the time anyone arrived to intercept him. It's the single most violent entry in the entire file, and it happens at the exact moment someone finally succeeds at physically restraining him, which tells you something uncomfortable about what actually triggers his worst behavior. Not cruelty offered freely. Cruelty offered specifically when he's cornered and has nothing left to lose by using it. There's a grim symmetry worth naming between this moment and the phone call recorded just before it. The same fear that made him beg not to be hurt for falling behind on his quota is very likely the exact fear driving what happens next. Cornered, restrained, with no door left to retreat through, he doesn't lash out like a predator finally allowed to attack. He responds like someone with genuinely nothing left to lose, choosing the one option available to him that guarantees he isn't the one who ends up paying the final price for this particular encounter. Strip away the horror, transaction by transaction, and what's left looks less like a monster and more like an exhausted employee working a job he never chose for himself. A boss he's visibly afraid of. A quota he can't seem to escape no matter how many houses he visits. A promotion to a department as mundane as accounting that never actually seems to arrive. None of that makes any single transaction in this file less dangerous. The rose still stopped a man's heart. The coins still killed an entire team of Foundation agents. But it recontextualizes every one of those outcomes in a way most Keter-class files this channel has covered never attempt. Most entries under that classification want you to fear something alien, something that thinks nothing like you do. This one wants you to recognize the shape of the fear instead. A cornered employee, terrified of a superior nobody else has ever seen, taking that fear out on whoever happens to be standing closest when the pressure finally becomes too much. The Foundation can't contain him for the same reason no company has ever successfully contained an underperforming, desperate salesperson working in unwanted territory. There's no cell built for a supply chain nobody's ever managed to trace back to its source, and no procedure written yet for an entity whose real problem was never the transactions at all. It was always whoever's on the other end of that phone call, still completely unidentified, still somewhere above him in an org chart the Foundation has never once managed to see. It's worth asking, too, why this particular framing works as well as it does on an audience that has never worked a job anything like his. You don't need to understand supernatural sales quotas to recognize the shape of dread in someone terrified of a call from their boss. This channel has spent 5 separate episodes explaining sums, gods, and monsters built out of pure cosmic scale. This file does something none of those could. It builds its horror out of something almost embarrassingly familiar, and lets that familiarity do the frightening instead of spectacle. So that's SCP-1879, the Indoor Salesman. A knock that won't stop until you open the door. A pitch you never asked to hear. A price that's never actually about money. And somewhere above all of it, a boss neither you nor the Foundation has ever managed to identify. A rose that cost a man his heart, and 200 bananas that cost a family nothing but their candy. 12 years taken from a woman in Seattle in exchange for a dog she never should have had to trade for. 2,000 coins that ended an entire Foundation team the one time someone finally managed to corner him. Most Keter-class files this channel has covered want something enormous from you, your fear, your certainty that you're looking at a monster. This one only ever wanted to make its numbers for the month, and somewhere in Washington State tonight, another door is about to start knocking. I'm Shroudex. See you in the dark. And if a door in your own house ever starts knocking on its own, don't answer it before you're sure who's really asking. There's a reason this file has stuck with readers of this archive for as long as it has, long after flashier, bigger budget-sounding entries have faded from casual conversation. It doesn't need scale to unsettle you. It just needs you to recognize, somewhere in the back of your mind, exactly what it feels like to be cornered by someone selling you something you never wanted, terrified of what happens to them if you say no, and only half paying attention to what it's actually going to cost you in the end.